Hello and welcome to the 495. I'm your host, Doug Sparks, editor-in-chief of Merrimack Valley Magazine. Lou, how are you this week?
Doing very well today.
Yeah.
Get a little break in the heat today, so that's exciting.
Yeah. Although I feel like the temperature's going to rise despite the rain.
Oh yeah, you think so?
That was my sense
Okay.
when I left the house. I should learn my lesson and not leave the house. I've decided because every time I do something, I got in my car this morning and all the warning lights went off in the dashboard.
Oh no!
And I thought, well, what am I going to do now? What's going to happen with the show? I don't know. But then it was also, well, it rained and there was a temperature drop, so maybe that's what caused it.
Yep.
So I went to the gas station, checked the tire pressure on my cars, turned the car on again, no problem.
Yep.
Drove fine. So
Self-healed.
But the lesson to me was do not leave the house. Don't leave the house.
It's not a bad lesson.
Scary out there.
In 2020, that's not a bad lesson.
Sure. My guest today is Susan Sirois, who is the executive director of Bread and Roses in Lawrence. Susan, are you there? Can you hear me?
Oh.
Hey, so...
Yeah, she's
can you hear me?
there.
Okay, oh, great. So
That was me.
Okay. So, Susan, for people who don't know Bread and Roses, tell me a little bit about the organization. When did it start and what does it do?
Bread and Roses has been on Newbury Street for 40 years, just about 40 years. October is our anniversary. We were started by a couple of Catholic nuns who saw the need in the community and got together with a couple of their friends, really a grassroots organization. And we were situated in a little building down the street for 2 or 3 years. We bought the building where we are, and we've been there for about 37 years now. We're certainly not a religious organization, never have been, but we were founded on the Catholic worker principle, teachings of the gospel with social justice.
Is that your background?
Excuse me?
Do you come from a religious background? What was your involvement with the Catholic worker? Would you call it a perspective or organization?
That was actually the way it was founded. It was founded by 2 nuns, and that was the basis that made sense to them to start to provide social service.
Sure.
And the mission has been the same for 40 years. Provide services with dignity and respect, without cost, question, or wait for anyone who requests them. So we really, when we're doing services now, we may get some vague information if it's a pantry order, how many people in the family, any medical conditions, but we don't ask for name, rank, or serial number because that's not what we do. If someone asks for something, we give it to them. So for the last 40 years, we've been providing meals 5 nights a week, emergency pantry services, weather appropriate clothing, hygiene supplies. We have a doctor on site provided through Greater Lawrence Family Healthcare with a grant from Healthcare for the Homeless. And we have a huge outreach program that's done nothing but grow since the COVID pandemic hit.
Sure. Well, we'll get to the COVID, but before we get to that, I'm just curious, how does an organization like Bread and Roses change over time? In other words, it's been around for 40 years. What did it look like in 1980 versus what it looked like in 2019?
In a lot of different ways, it really didn't change. I've been at Bread and Roses for 5 years, and what was very surprising to me was that for those first 35 years, they really wanted to keep a very low profile. If you've ever seen the building on Newbury Street, you would walk right by it and never know it was Bread and Roses. It's a beautiful old brick building. It looks like it could be a home. And that's the way the board and the staff wanted it for those 35 years, to be able to just have people come into a very safe, clean, bright environment, to be able to help themselves to coffee and tea and that sort of thing, and have their meal, go home, and come back again tomorrow. We're a home. We're a haven for these folks. We're their families. The services that we provide grew organically, and I think that they, for many years, weren't planned. When guests would come in for dinner, if you knew so-and-so needed a pair of sneakers or didn't have one pair of gloves, you dug through your closet and you brought them in. So I think through the years, the services sort of formalized themselves, And when I got there 5 years ago, there was a room full of clothing. There was several shelves full of toiletries and diapers and formula. And so my sense in hearing the old stories was that those services just grew on their own. And so what I've tried to do in the time that I've been there is to really shore up the emergency pantry and to shore up the weather appropriate clothing. And now we have a dedicated seniors and veterans pantry. And part of that includes pet food for our folks. We have a Fresh Start initiative. And folks don't have to be a guest of Bread and Roses, but they can certainly come to us and, just answer a few demographic questions for reporting. But we can give them a laundry cart, which gives them access to 4 loads of laundry a month. We'll give them laundry soap. We're trying to get up donations of laundry bags, but I'm trying to create the programs that have the most meaning for folks who would need to depend on a soup kitchen for food or for pantry items.
Mm. About prior to COVID, about how many people a year did you serve? Do you know?
We serve, I would have to go and look at my paperwork, but I would say that we serve anywhere from 80 to 110, 120 people an evening through outreach. Last fiscal year, the numbers are coming out. I would say that probably we did over 100,000 meals last year.
And how much of this is powered through full-time or part-time staff, and how much relies upon volunteers?
Right now, we have 4 full-time staff, and we have 7 part-time staff. And most of the part-time staff are kitchen staff. So really, one of the things we like to say often is that we're passion heavy and administratively light. There's not a lot of hands that do what we do. And one of the main reasons that we get to provide services in such a seamless fashion is because of the amount of volunteers we have, whether they come in during the day to help us prepare a meal or clean the building or package giveaway meals or produce for at night, whether it's the folks who come in to serve and clean up the evening meal. And again, that's sort of what we're looking at now going forward, because we probably won't have volunteers in the building for months to come. So it's going to impact services a bit, but it's a very light staff for the amount of work that we put out the door every day.
Where do you get your funding?
Funding is mainly through grants, businesses, individuals, churches. We have a lot of, most of our grants are repeat funders, but it's nice to see that every year we're able to get new funders. Most of the grants we get are unrestricted, meaning they can pay for the lights, they can pay staff, they can buy gas for our outreach van. We're very fortunate. We got our most recent grant. We got a $30,000 grant from 3M. And as we speak, there's a brand new walk-in custom-built freezer being put in our basement. So we try to keep our equipment as current as we possibly can. Part of our thrust is to have as green a footprint as we can. We were lucky enough to get another grant, a Cummings Foundation Award, and we put solar panels on the roof several years ago, and we were just awarded a second Cummings Award grant. So that's a feather in our cap.
Yeah. Do you get funding from the city of Lawrence or from the state or from the federal government?
In our 40-year history, we've never taken federal, state, or city money. And really, most of the reason for that is that they empirical data, anecdotal data is not enough for reporting. They do want name, rank, and serial number. And our mission has always thrived and survived without that. And it's that measure of respect. Ask no questions.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So doing that lets you be less bureaucratic light, and as you said.
And I will tell you the story that we often laugh about. Our rules, we don't have many. We have 3 rules: no violence, no weapons, no substances on property. And those are pretty easy rules to abide by. And so we realize that sometimes people come in and they've been using substances and they're not maybe always their typical happy self. And so there were just some things, obviously, because of the other folks that are in the building. We sometimes have to invite people to leave and come back the next night. And so rules are always hard and fast until they're not. And one of those is that we always like folks to have a referral for our emergency pantry, a doctor, a neighbor, a therapist. Just this person really needs some food. Can you give it to them? But of all the people who come in for food that don't have a referral, we give them food anyway. So it's like we play this game with ourselves, but we realize that somebody would not come to our door and ask if there wasn't a need. So,
sure. Yeah. So, I'm going to ask this again later in the show, but I wanted to ask you right now, since we're on the subject, if people wanted to donate to the organization, how would they go about doing that?
Well, I would say the first best measure, you can go to our website, breadandroseslawrence.org. And there's all sorts of opportunities because we know donations could be many things. You can talk with the staff. We always have a list of critical needs. But especially during this sideways time, we're finding that cash is easier because, again, it can be gas for the van. It can be protein if we're running low. It can be deodorant if we're running low. Cash can be anything.
Okay, so people can find this information on your website.
breadandroseslawrence.org. Yes, there's always a critical needs list, but there's other options. Market basket cards, money for laundry cards. It could be many students will have sneaker drives or used dungaree drives or hats and gloves. We're not that far away from the wind starting to blow again. So donations can be huge, and donations can be a package of hot dog rolls.
Do you have an active Facebook page?
We do.
Okay, so people can look you up there as well and get some of this information.
Yes.
So the name, Bread and Roses, where does that come from?
Peggy and Mary actually took it from the Bread and Roses strike of 1912. They just felt that grassroots movement really spoke to what they wanted to create for meal services and for social services, that we were all in this together, and that when we bonded together, much more was possible than if it was a solitary voice speaking. And I think it's still true. It's very much the mission now. Some of our volunteers have been there for 40 years.
Why would someone stick around for that long? What is it about the organization that keeps people loyal in that way?
I really think because we have stayed so true to the mission. I guess there's a lot of answers to that, Doug, and I think one of them, or the easiest one for me, is when you're looking for a project or you're looking for an answer or whatever that is. You know how you feel when you have that aha moment, when suddenly the clouds part? That's how people are when they walk into Bread and Roses. I've worked in a lot of nonprofits in a lot of different agencies, different kinds of agencies. And I will tell you that I have never seen an agency like Bread and Roses. It sounds sort of like rainbows and lollipops, but we have folks who come in at 10 o'clock in the morning to help us clean the bathrooms and clean the basement. And we have people who come in on Saturdays to paint the back door and sweep the parking lot. But I think it is so vibrant and so real and so upfront that there's no judgment. There's no, we are people. There's no adjectives. There's no labels. And so the passion is there for the mission to just do the right thing in the world. That food is something that everyone is entitled to, and warm clothing, and without having to jump through a hoop. It's just there. It's what we'd want for ourselves. It's certainly what we extend to our families. And, you know, I have a story about my son moving far away many, many years ago, and he was in a little bit of trouble physically. He had an injury, and a family just kind of took him in for a few days and helped him. And as a college student being on a road trip, he didn't look great. He didn't smell great. But these folks just took him in and helped him and sent him off with their phone number and a bag full of food and said, hey, if you need help west of the Mississippi, call us. And so it became very clear to me at that point that that's it. That's why we're doing what we're doing. I can't expect the universe to take care of my son if we don't take care of all the sons and moms and dads that come to us.
So,
So it's
so
there. It's there for me. It's there for the folks who come in the door to volunteer. It's very real.
great. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about yourself in your biography. Did you grow up around here?
I grew up in Salem, New
You
Hampshire.
grew up in
Yes.
okay. And so, how did you get into this line of work? At what age did you decide that this was your path in life?
Um, it came a little bit later in life. I went back to school. I raised my family very young. And when they were graduating high school and college, I kind of jumped into the pool and one graduated one year and one the next year. And I brought up the end of the line. And I actually thought I was going to be working in addictions and probably in homeless services, maybe in the legal system. And before I settled on a job, I sort of drifted and saw what made sense. And I was at the Psychological Center in Lawrence for many, many years working in addictions and recovery. And I had a pretty close relationship with the gentleman at the time who was the director of Bread and Roses, Bob Lanzoni. And he was just a giant in the community and would often laugh with him about, boy, it's going to have to be somebody really crazy to take your job. And when he was ready to retire, I was that crazy person. And so when I came to Bread and Roses, it was the perfect marriage of everything I'd done. It was all of those folks from all of those communities. And now they're out in the community and they need help. And so for me, I get far more out of this job than I put into it every day. And again, it sounds like rainbows, but it's really true. This being able to help someone feel empowered or feel seen or heard, I could never give enough. I could never give enough. Never give enough. It's you take far more home with you at the end of the day.
Yeah,
It's selfish. I think it's selfishness that keeps me there.
sure. So I'm still curious about your education. Where did you said you went back to school? Where did you go to school initially? Where did you do undergrad?
I started off at a private Catholic school right around the corner from my house, and I finished up the last couple of semesters at Springfield.
Okay.
And after that, I had some really great opportunities. I was able to do some courses with the Massachusetts Department of Behavioral Health, and I was licensed as a crisis responder. So, should there be a natural disaster, I haven't had to do that in a very long time. But if there's a natural disaster, a hurricane, a fire, a 9/11, any one of those things, I'm licensed by FEMA to respond in a crisis. And it comes into practice more more every day of your life going to the grocery store than it does in one of those scenes. But I've had some really cool, I had some grief counseling. I've had some pretty great courses over the years that, again, plug into what you're doing every single day.
Yeah. So it sounds as though your skills were very general, and I'm wondering if that's an asset in the sort of work you're doing right now.
Um, I think if I had to pinpoint one that was most helpful, it was the grief counseling. Um,
Why is that?
there's Because of the population that typically comes through the door, there's so much loss. Um, when people, whether they're actively using or whether they're in recovery, um, I think that people who don't get addiction or who don't live with someone who's actively using don't understand that it's just really a chain of losses. You've lost maybe a family, you've lost a job, you've lost um, friends that you cared about, you've certainly lost self-respect. When you get into an active addiction, it's a series of losses. And then when you decide to get clean, if you ever decide to get clean, now you have to face those losses sober. And oftentimes that's what drags us back into that lifestyle because we can't find it in ourselves to have the emotional strength or courage to face those losses. And so one of the things we have to decide to do is to heal. We have to forgive ourselves. And in order to do that, you have to take stock of what was and where you are and bridge that. And that's a lot of acceptance. That's a lot of healing. And it's always been fascinating to me that, um, for instance, I worked in Middleton for a while, and it was always fascinating to see the gentlemen a week or two before they were ready to come home. They were so afraid because they knew they were going to go back to the same old. And they were so afraid of going back. And you try to help them. They almost willingly held on to all their sadness and all their stuff because it was all they knew. If they'd lost a parent or a friend while they were in jail, their sadness and their grief was all made sense to them to hang on to. And until they could let that go, they couldn't get on with the rest of their stuff. So it was a crazy cycle. And it just applies to so many of the folks who come in the door every day.
Sure. Well, this brings us up to COVID because I wanted to ask you about this. Are you seeing changes? Are you seeing heightened levels of addiction, heightened psychological stress because of the pandemic?
The short answer is yes. And I think what complicates that for the Merrimack Valley is after the gas explosions, right, a couple of years ago, of course, that was a community-wide disaster. And if we weren't directly impacted, we knew someone who was. And so I think the very quick review of that, I would think, would be to have a mind for where people still are with that, right? And that's some of that would be PTSD, right? Can't be diagnosed right away. It's either a real or perceived threat. It doesn't have to necessarily have happened to you. It could have happened to your neighbor. Quite honestly, it could be somebody watching halfway around the world. PTSD is not something that it doesn't have to happen to us directly. And so when you consider how devastating that was for our whole community, that was one of the things that folks started to look at in mental health right away. Oh, we have to start taking a look at children, everyone across the board to make sure we have mental health services. That was 2 years ago. And that was in one community. Now we have this huge worldwide pandemic on top of that nobody knows how to deal with this. And under the best of times, it's no time to quit drinking or drugging. These are the worst of times. Sure. And so it drives us to what's familiar. Even if it's not healthy, it drives us to what's familiar. And so it may keep people locked in those addictions, but it's also creating new and bigger issues, I think, that we're not going to be seeing for some months.
In terms of the organization, how has COVID impacted the work you're doing?
The building has been closed for some time because we closed in March to try to be able to stem the curve. And so what we did decide to do is keep outreach going. And so outreach, thank goodness, has been able to grow to meet the need. We have been able to deliver in April, May, and June over 215,000 pounds of food to area churches and agencies that are providing meal programs and pantry services.
How does that work? Is there a van that drives around and you have volunteers and staff? Like logistically, how do you deliver that much food?
Yes, actually, we have 2 outreach vans. We have an outreach staff, and because the workload has been so overwhelming, he's been able to choose family members or folks that he's familiar with, feels comfortable being with. Because again, it's the masks, it's the whole COVID tracking every single day to keep everyone safe. But what typically has happened throughout our history, and certainly the last few months, is that he has a daily schedule. And the Shaw's Warehouse in Methuen, Stop and Shop, Cumberland Farms, Chick-fil-A, Doyle and Bailey, Gorelick Farms, there's any Bimbo's Bakeries, there's any number of places that he has a regular schedule where he'll go and pick up. And sometimes we never know what we're going to get. When we go to the Shaw's Warehouse, it might be, a half a pallet of bananas and lettuce or yogurt. So we never quite know what we're going to get. But once he has the van full, he will then go to several sites to drop off. And he kind of tries to break up so that everybody gets the same sort of thing. But just in April, May, and June, one of the churches sends out food to 20 other churches, and that was about 520 families, about 2,000 people. And that's just one church.
So what are you looking at for we talked about this a little bit before the show, is the uncertain future because of this pandemic. Do you have any sense of where the organization is going now? How are you pivoting to deal with the pandemic? What does the fall look like? What does 2021 look like?
Well, we're working with the other agencies providing the same sorts of services in Lawrence. And so no one wants to back off with the service if someone is not there to keep the safety net going. So right now we're talking about reopening because we realize Lawrence is coming down in numbers. But we're very mindful that the reason we closed the door in March was to flatten the curve, was to try to keep the people in the building and the people coming to the door as safe as we possibly could. And our concern now, of course, is what's going on in California and Florida and Texas. So I don't think that that's necessarily going to prevent us from reopening, but we want to be able to be as mindful as we can about the people coming up to the porch. We want to keep them socially distant. We want to make sure they all have masks. But as far as what will happen when we reopen, we'll probably be doing grab-and-go meals for a while, meaning that people can come up onto the porch, hopefully grab a meal, whether that's a sandwich and fruit and water, or whether it's a hot meal in the fall. We're going to try to provide fresh produce with that as well so that people can take home a meal and some pantry items. We're already talking again with Greater Lawrence Family Healthcare. When the doors open again, they're going to send the doc to the building. And of course, during the day, we're going to do our best to meet the clothing and hygiene orders. Pantry services are a given. We know that if the $600 in unemployment tax is going to go away at the end of the month, people are really going to be in some desperate straits starting in August and September. And the other concern that makes us want to open our doors is that if all the school children are not back in school in September, there's going to be a lot of hungry kids in the city that we're going to need to fold into the net somehow.
Before I turn this over to Lou and see if he has any questions, you have an annual event that I think is in May. Is your annual event typically in May?
June?
In June, okay. And that went virtual this year, right?
No, we had to cancel.
Oh, you completely canceled?
We completely canceled.
Do you have any plans for virtual fundraisers or any sort of fundraising drive or anything? Or are we just hoping for June 2021 and things maybe going a little bit more back to normal?
Actually, we closed when we decided to cancel our comedy show in May. Because again, then we thought, well, maybe people will come out in May. We had no idea what was happening. So we decided to do a virtual online COVID-19 appeal. And so that was very successful. Thank goodness.
It was.
Yes, it was. People were very, very generous. And there's actually a thought, a giving. There's a philosophy about in emergency situations, people tend to give more. Because they very much identify with it. And so the event was very successful. And so typically we will do our annual appeal around the holidays. We're going to start that off a little bit early this year. We're probably going to start it off in September or October. And so we always try to have donation information and many different choices on the website that if people want to help us provide for our Christmas bags, for instance, we'll give everyone a lot of options so that if you have $20 to spend or you have $1,000 to spend, there's something that you can contribute so that we can then split those items up and put them in our holiday bags for guests. But there's always, in a nonprofit, particularly one that doesn't take state or city money, there's always a fundraiser going on of some kind. What we fear is going to be impacted this year is our community food drives. We have 3 or 4 that typically take place from September, October through the holidays. And they might have to be pop the trunk events, but we're not sure the status of those food drives. And that's what fuels our meal program and our pantries. So that's significant. We have to figure that out soon.
Are you also worried, like you mentioned this philosophy that people tend to give more in times of crisis? Are you worried that this sense of crisis just becomes the new normal and then donations are going to drop off?
I can't say. I'm afraid because of the extended time that people are going to get burned out. Not just burned out with giving, but burned out with feeling like that helplessness, hopelessness. That's a terrible place to be. Not just for Bread and Roses, but as a person in the community. But, there's that part of me that thinks this is how we've always done everything, not just at Bread and Roses or in Lawrence, but this is how, just even in the States, we've always survived. We've always come together. And one of our annual appeal last year was, interestingly enough, stone soup. That old story about to bring everybody together and make something better out of nothing. And I think that's what I'd like to think right now. I think the new normal, we're going to be depending on each other for things we never thought we would. But I think we're also going to weave that into a new reality, a new positive reality. Our parents did during the war, our grandparents did during the Depression. There's always been a challenge that's made us dig deep and bring something positive to the table. And for me, I will never focus on what I can't. I will focus on what I can. And even if that's a little, when you put that together in a big pot, it ends up to be a nice soup.
Well, I love your sense of optimism. I wish we could all be so optimistic. Maybe you've inspired some listeners. Lou, do you have any questions for Sue?
Yeah, I'm glad you get into this subject because this is something I wanted to explore a little bit more. And you kind of alluded to a couple things that I was worried about and find interesting. I was going to ask you what the relationship is between your donors and your volunteers. I mean, we're all experiencing stress right now, and stress is relative, but everybody in their life has stress. And I was wondering about donations, and I thought, well, I know in my own personal life, I've got money hanging around a little bit because I'm not going out to dinner. I'm not spending it like I used to. There's no place to go and spend it. So I have a little extra. So you said donations are up a little bit, but then you started talking about, and this is what concerns me, we're working off stimulus. We're working with a light at the end of the tunnel, and it's very possible we could come to the end of stimulus. We could come to the end of the light at the end of the tunnel in terms of a second wave coming on, reclosures. God knows what's in the next few weeks of our future. You feel that in terms of increased need for your organization, and do you feel that for diminishing of generosity to your organization?
I think I would say yes and no. We really do have a very good funding base with foundation grants and with the Cummings Foundation. I don't know if you're familiar with those folks,
yes,
but all of their properties along 128. And so we're working with a Cummings Foundation grant right now. So I'm not going to say that we're all set for fiscal year 21. I would never say that. However, we've been very fortunate to have resources that we could fall back on.
So you've got a firewall of sorts in the organization, a financial firewall.
We do have something of a firewall, but I will also tell you that of all the meals that we put out and all the outreach that we did last year, we spent a little bit less than $8,000 on food because of the donation.
Yeah.
And so what I've found so far is that the places who donate to us have really rallied to the cause and have really dug deeper. Now, do I know that that can go on for another 6 or 12 months? I don't. But I get the sense that because this has always been the trajectory of Bread and Roses, good times or bad times, there's always a consistent thread. And I have to believe that when we're working together as a community, we try not to go to the well too often. We try to only utilize our strengths. One of my recommendations will be to the board this year that because we've got such a broad range of programs that I think really make sense for our community, we can do food, we can do meals, we can do healthcare services, and hygiene and clothing and laundry cards. I think what we need to do right now is to stay put, to strengthen those programs as much as we can, and to just wait out the storm. I have a good communication with one of the staff from Lazarus House. And again, we try to stay very much on the same page. And they're of a like philosophy is as long as we keep our heads down and keep doing what we're doing, we will always provide. One of the things that Bread and Roses likes to do for every meal is we'll do 3 to 4 ounces of protein in every meal that we serve because we realize we're the only protein. I can't ever imagine that we're not going to be able to do that because that's part of what we do. We may have, a few less vegetables. I think if the donation went down, we might have rice a couple more times a month, but I don't think that as far as food would go, we'd ever take a hit on that. But as far as the generosity of donors, I think because we give them such a broad platform to choose from, people can donate money, they can donate stuff, they can donate new stuff. So again, if you're not able to, really give, $20, at Christmas time, you could very really go into the office and say, okay, everybody, I need your old jackets, your old coats, and your old work boots. We need those things. Those are a donation for us.
You talked a little earlier about your work in addiction with the Psychological Center, and there's a lot of talk about dual diagnosis and addiction, and talked about the concern of treating the addiction, and then they go back into the lifestyle and repeat the cycle. Much of the same things can be said for hunger and homelessness to an extent. How do you integrate within the community to do some of that work that helps outside of the immediate need of feeding a family?
That's a really good question. We try to work with as many agencies as we possibly can to keep that safety net very pliable. And one of the things that happened the very first week that we were closed is I was on a Zoom call with many, many different agencies in Lawrence. And there were a few folks that I worked with for many years. And so we decided to kind of break off into our own little group. And we decided that we would work together to just exactly this end. And so Ken Campbell initially was the gentleman I worked with from Lazarus House. Jeff Hassel, their new director, is behind us. We're talking with Nancy Cannell from Project Home Again, and Kim Goulet from Community Giving Tree, and Anna Luna from Act Lawrence, and Fran from the People's Pantry in North Andover. And so what we're doing is we're all working together to provide services just a little bit differently. For instance, for Project Home Again, who is able to give household items to folks, and Community Giving Tree, who gives child and infant clothing and formula and diapers, that sort of thing. They usually require a social worker to make a referral. So through Bread and Roses, because we have a whole cadre of pastors who are making pantries every single day, we'll allow the pastors, when they see someone in need, to fill out the paperwork and make the referral directly themselves to one of the agencies, whether it's a food pantry or Community Giving Tree or Project Home Again, so that in real time, if one of the pastors sees that someone needs clothes, I'll go upstairs to my clothing closet. If they have something for a child or if they need a couch, they'll call one of the other agencies. Act Lawrence has been helping people to fill out their unemployment papers. So together, our few agencies have put out our own safety net, not just for our neighborhood, but across Lawrence, to catch the people who are new to unemployment. Some of them are undocumented. But there's so many people in Lawrence right now who can't access services, don't know where to get services, but they know to go to church. And if they can communicate that need to their pastor, we're in touch with them to provide services.
And finally, my last question, I want to talk about what you guys were talking about at the beginning on why it's so appealing for volunteers to work at Bread and Roses and why it was so appealing for you to go there. And I always tend towards Bread and Roses types of organizations and charities because you can send a check off to a major charity and it goes off and it helps somebody or it gets lost in the ocean. Or you can go to a community-based charity
Right.
and see specific work. In other words, I'm less interested in solving the world's hunger problem than in feeding a few families in the greater Lawrence area and doing that kind of work and seeing it happen in my community and having a much more direct connection to that help. And that's why we need organizations like Bread and Roses. That's the real grit of it, because it actually is tangible help in your community that your donors and your volunteers and workers can have a more direct connection to.
I completely agree. And you'd be surprised how many little nonprofits in Lawrence are, I'm not going to say they're a mirror image of Bread and Roses, but that we have the same mission.
Yeah.
Adjectives go out the window. And again, it's what we want for our own families. It's what we want for our friends. Food is something that everyone should have, and they shouldn't have to jump through hoops to get it. And whenever anyone comes in with any kind of a donation, large or small, we always ask them to come back. We always ask them, don't call ahead, just drop in. Whether you come in at 10:30 in the morning or you come in at 4:30 at night to see people come through the door. That's the heart and soul of it. And I will tell you that more than one time, I've seen people I know, people I've gone to school with, people who live across town coming through the door in need of a meal. And that's a gift. That's a gift to be able to see those folks come in and just say, hi, I haven't seen you in such a long time. Come on, I made the soup. If I know the soup is good, I will lie and say I made it. If it's not so good, I say that somebody else made it. But it's really nice to have that small connection and say, it's so good to see you. Come on in.
Yeah, and I guess it's selfish in a way, but by the same token, being that close to that help and seeing it actually come to fruition it's just good for the soul. It just makes you more intense about it.
It's very good for the soul. But when I tell you that's what drives us, it really is. I think it's a selfish need. It just feels so good to know that you've done one thing, just one simple thing. And oftentimes it's just a touch on the shoulder or a hello at the door. The food's great. That will keep you alive. But this is the time, it's the roses part of the Bread and Roses. It's the nourishing the soul, right? Food is food, but hope is hope. It's something completely different.
Yeah. Susan, thank you so much for being on the 495. Would you mind giving the webpage out one more time?
It is breadandroseslawrence.org.
Okay, great. So my guest today was Susan Sirois. She's the executive director of Bread and Roses in Lawrence. They're celebrating their 40th anniversary this year. Next week, our guest will be Phil Mastroianni, who's the co-founder of Fabrizia Spirits. He does craft limoncello, and in the age of COVID, he does hand sanitizer as well.
Is he sending samples?
I haven't gotten any samples yet. I'll check the mailbox. All right, thank you, Lou. Thanks, Susan.
All right, you're welcome. Thank you so much.